So I guess I should give the warnings first about this process. It is not cheap, especially if you screw up. It makes it twice as expensive because you basically get to start from scratch if you mess up. And you can mess up at every step of the process, so you're not safe at any point in time doing this. So it can be kind of a nerve-wracking thing to go through. So basically, sculpting is where you start. This is an armature. You can get these online primarily. I haven't really found anywhere locally where you can get a good armature. This is obviously for masks. I basically had to create my own armatures for feet and hands. Usually I just did that using old wire hangers. But you want to get the good wire hangers that have really stiff wire, because you can get really flimsy ones, those won't do you any good. So the more rigid your armatures are, the better off you're going to be putting clay onto them. If molding and casting is your end game with this, especially with this sort of thing, if you buy these pre-made, this is kind of like a fiberglass type of material. They're hollow inside. You're going to want to actually fill that up with something heavy. Ultra Cal 30, which is what this end product is, just quick setting cement. You're going to want to fill that up a decent amount, because the more weight you have, the better off you're going to be. And it'll make it so that this won't tear apart when you're tearing that off of it.
You don't have to, do you have to drill the hole in there or anything?
No, well,
it's open?
Yeah, that's how they make these. Okay. They basically had a mold, poured in the stuff, and popped this out. So it's going to have a hollow inside. So yeah, the Ultra Cal 30, which is what's in here. This is your quick setting cement, and it's just a powder. Feels like flour, and you just add water to it. And there's a specific way, and we'll get to that in a minute on how you do that. But first, we'll get to the sculpting end of things. With sculpting, you're going to have, there's really three basic kinds of clay. You got water-based clay, oil-based clay, and wax-based clay. The only thing you really need to worry about for any of the clays is to make sure that they're sulfur-free. Sulfur has this tendency to react with quick setting cement, because quick setting cement heats up when it's curing, and you don't want sulfur in your clay because it can cause a chemical reaction. It probably won't, but you don't want to have sulfur just for that reason alone. This is the clay I use primarily. This is made by Monster Makers. And there is a little bit of a waxy property to it, but it's their proprietary oil-based kind of clay. It's really hard when it's just at room temperature. You end up having to stick it in an oven at about 200 degrees for about 10 minutes or so is all, and it will soften it so that you can actually use it. The good thing about that kind of clay, and there's actually a little pamphlet thing that they sent when you buy a bunch of it, is it holds detail really, really well. It'll give you the most minute detail, and as long as you sculpt it correctly anyways, it will pull it out when you make a mold. The downsides to it is that it's not cheap. This 5-pound bucket is, they may have lowered the price, but I still think it's around 30 bucks for 5 pounds of it. I have 20 pounds of it at home, including that one. So, you know, it's going to be the longest lasting stuff. It doesn't dry out. So you could sculpt something, get it halfway done, and leave it for a few months, come right back to it, and it's not going to be dried out. It's going to be still usable. You'll have to probably heat it a little bit. Heat guns work really well, just kind of quick once over with a heat gun on this particular kind of clay, and you will actually be able to kind of mold it and sculpt it again as well as you want to. You can put this in a microwave. They don't recommend it just because microwaves heat from the inside out, and so you're going to have this lava ball in the middle of there, and then you won't know exactly where you hit it. If you have a smaller mountain here, if you really dug it out, you can hit it with the microwave real quick for like 10-15 seconds, and that should, get it warm enough you can utilize most of it. So, yeah, if you got a full thing, don't stick it in the microwave. It does not work.
How much does it say expand, or how much
this
is
doesn't.
5 pounds? So
this is an oil-based clay. Oil-based clay, its properties basically mean that you can reuse it, and it'll tell you all on there.
Yeah, so when you
can heat it up and pour it, because it'll become liquid, and reuse it. And that I could fill that back up with clay and basically create my sculpt again.
Yeah. So you can melt down whatever you just did.
Yep.
And just use it again.
And I'm tempted to do that with this one, because I made this. This is the end mask that I made out of that, but I made it a little too small for my head anyway. So I'll probably have to re-sculpt the whole thing completely. And that's one of the main parts of sculpting, is when you start a sculpt, especially with a mask, and I'll just assume everyone's trying to make a mask here, you actually need to add a base layer of maybe an inch and a half before you actually start sculpting, because your head still needs to fit in whatever you're trying to make. And unless you have a very small head, even I have a small head, and that's too little for me. That might fit a kid, really. But when you block in your sculpting, block in about an inch and a half first, and then start sculpting, because otherwise you're just going to end up with something you can't use. On the other hand, no pun intended, when I made these are a little too big for my hands. I can still wear them, and they're still usable, but they're kind of a pain to wear because they are slightly too long in the fingers. I didn't quite, it's pretty significant difference in there. So you gotta, that's kind of where a variable is when you're sculpting, is when you make your armature, make it as close to whatever part you're going to make. Feet are not as big an issue, but you do want to make these much bigger than you normally wear a shoe on. Those are probably a size 13 or something. I only wear like a 10 and a half, because I have to fit a shoe inside of there when I wear them. And so
can I see the bottom?
So this, I did that. I just printed out a thing, cut it out, and sculpted. I kind of made like a stamp, and it was inverted. So when I made the foot mold, which is just really just one big thick piece of latex, it put a little Predator stamp on there. So it kind of just something I added on extra. But so with sculpting, there's people who are just naturally good at it, which I kind of am. I just sat down and decided to sculpt one day, and honestly, that's what, I did look up YouTube a little bit. YouTube is going to be your best friend, because so many people put so many different kind of sculpting techniques and everything. I could spend a full semester's worth of sculpting classes, and I wouldn't be able to tell you everything. You got to really put in your own time researching it. I know there's classes locally. Some people will teach you on this whole process. I don't know where they're held at, but I know there's some places that will actually teach you how to do this on a case-by-case basis. So really, YouTube is going to be your best friend. There's different forums, depending on what you're trying to create, that can help you out with people, who've been through it. I would recommend another website. I'll put it up here. If nobody's heard of it, I'll be surprised, but it's just the RPF. And that's people who will post, anything and everything to do with costuming and tell you how to do it, and they'll put, people where they show off. That's a good site to get an idea for all sorts of things. Most people on that site seem to go for the foam, just because it's easiest. Like I said, this is not a cheap endeavor at all. Luckily, I've made my money back in it with costume contests and stuff, but really I wanted just to make this because it was like a pipe dream for me. So that's why I went into it, and luckily enough, I've been good enough at it. So sculpting-wise, Get back to the clay. We got this oil-based clay, water-based clay. If anybody's watched Face Off, that's what they use almost exclusively.
Water-based?
Water-based clay.
Yeah.
Water-based clay is good because it doesn't require any heat up. You can just cut it, use it, sculpt it. You can kick out something really fast with it. The bad side is if you're not really good at sculpting and you take a long time, it will most likely dry out. You can spray down with a water bottle, keep it moist and damp so that it is still usable. But if you don't act on it soon enough, it'll dry out and you'll ruin a sculpt and you'll have to start over. Water-based clay, for my purposes, are mainly used for the molding process because you actually use clay to build walls around things so that you can actually make a half of a mold. And I'll get into that in just a minute. And then wax-based clay is kind of the same as this. It's not as hard when you use it. It's not as easily found either, I've discovered, but the good thing with wax-based clay is it acts as its own release agent because nothing really sticks to wax when you're using concrete. So that's its biggest thing. This can kind of work in the same way. It doesn't really need a release agent, but you're going to want to use a release agent because getting molds apart are, or at least can be, one of the most strenuous part of the whole process because that's where things break. And that's where your whole work up to that point will get ruined because you have to start over. So sculpting, that's your basic idea of what you need is what kind of clay to go with. And another good thing with water-based clay is that it's pretty cheap. You're looking at probably maybe $13 for a block of 10 pounds of it or so. So if you're going to start small, get some water-based clay, figure out what your sculpting abilities are, and then kind of do your homework, watch some videos, and try different techniques out. And so when you get to using this more expensive stuff, even though you can reuse it over and over and over again, you're going to be better off with a finished product because you're going to know what you're going to be doing based off of what you did with water-based clay.
On the water-based clay, what kind of time frame are you talking about on dry out? I mean, are we talking hours, 10 minutes?
It depends on how much you actually have on your sculpt. You can easily, I mean, when you're sculpting, throughout the process, periodically, you're going to need to mist it down because it can dry out pretty quick. Right. If you leave it overnight, you definitely have to mist it, and then you definitely have to cover it in plastic. Some people actually wrap.
That's why they wrap it in plastic.
Some people actually wrap damp paper towels on it and then cover it just to keep it
wet.
Oh.
Okay.
So that's why they do that, because it will dry out and ruin a sculpt. It can be really fickle. And depends on how much clay you have on. Obviously, if it's denser, lower down, it's just your surface mainly that you got to worry about.
And obviously, if you overwet it, it's going to run.
It'll run and it'll ruin whatever detail you got.
Exactly.
So there's a balance. I mean, misting it is usually good enough. You don't got to go overboard with it or anything. So, I mean, but I started using this stuff. I just went in head first, really. So, kind of went overboard, I think, in some respects. But it ended up working out eventually.
Would you say, though, so let's say you took an oil one, you took a water one, you did them both in half an hour or whatever, you made something that quick.
Okay.
When you actually mold and cast, are you going to get a different detail? Are you going to actually get a better quality out of the oil?
Well, yes. This holds its detail much better.
Okay.
There's going to be just some sculpting techniques you can't use, period, because the water-based clay just can't hold the detail well. But I've seen some pretty insane detail out of professionals who use water-based clay. But I mean, that's like on a whole other stratosphere of stuff. So, you know, for our purposes, this is going to hold your detail. Like I've got, you know, little details all through here. Some of this, like with the kind of the skin texturing I have on this, that probably wouldn't have showed up with water-based clay. So that's kind of the clay-based end of things. There's some tools you'll obviously go through. Clay cutter, pretty simple. This is not really going to be so useful with this kind of clay. This is more for your water-based clay, because water-based clay, I mean, it's like a knife through butter. Real nice and easy. You will need one of these. And then you have a bunch of other small, minor tools. Now, most of these tools came out of a kit from monstermakers.com. This entire kit came with this armature, 10 pounds of clay, a whole series of small tools that are helpful. It came with some burlap, which comes into the casting process. It came with a little bit of latex as well. The only thing it didn't come with was Ultra Cal 30, which is what is namely the only thing you're going to use for making a mold. That kit, last I saw, was $400. Not cheap, but it gives you pretty much everything you need to make a mask over and over again. You know, these are kind of kidney, that's what they're called, they're kidneys. These are used mainly for smoothing out. You've got your small detail tools, and they're all dirty, but...
And where did you get that kit from? Or was this...
Monstermakers.com is where I got it for a birthday present. My wife got it for me years ago. And so, then you got things that shave off the stuff, finer tool stuff, smaller shave tools. You will figure out how to use these tools as you're sculpting. It's kind of a, you know, just kind of try and see how it works type of thing. But really it's, you know, even if you watched all the YouTube videos in the world and tried to get every technique down, there's always going to be some different way of doing it. So whatever you learn is not going to be, you know, scripture. There's going to be some various different way to do something, and something that might work better for you. It's great thing about clay is you can just experiment endlessly with it. And there's like, this is a tool that is not a clay tool. This is something you pop zits with. And I figured I need something that's smaller that I can actually gouge out and get some more detail with. So I just found it randomly in some old box or whatever and started using it, and it actually works better than quite a bit of other tools. Like this is kind of a bigger version of what that is. So, you know, I've used the end of paintbrushes to get some detail that I want. And there's, you know, you got these wood pieces. Wood is good because it actually gives you a smooth surface if you're, you know, trying to make a flat, rounded surface or something like that. That will not leave track marks or any sort of detailing that you don't need. I actually use the wood piece, or this wood part on a lot of that to keep it relatively smooth. Something else.
So smoothing out, you wouldn't suggest something like your fingers to use to smooth
No,
out?
well, that's the thing. Your hands are going to be the best tools that you have, no matter all these other tools. These are your best tools, most important, I guess. But there's going to be some things you can't do with your hands, like texturing.
Right.
And part of the kit that came with my Monster Makers kit was these silicone stamps. And basically all you do is you kind of warm up an area, just kind of apply it, take it apart, and it'll hold its texture that it has on those. And it comes with like 15 of those little silicone stamps, and they're really easy to apply. And you can actually, before you put much detail on, lay that all down, cover a whole sculpt in whatever texture you want, and then go with the finer details if you wanted to, if you needed a certain skin tone or whatever. And then you can also use brushes. Brushes are mainly used more for water-based clay because you can actually texture water-based clay with a brush, and you can just rinse the brush out because it's all water-based, obviously. But brushes are often used to create some sort of a stippling effect or whatever, but that's mainly going to be useful with water-based clay. There's going to be certain techniques you can't really use with oil-based clay unless you heat it up and run the risk of making it run and liquefying. So, like I said, pros and cons with each kind of clay material, but you kind of go with what you work best with. And that's really the basics of sculpting.
You said you started with the oil-based?
Yeah, I started with this stuff just because I knew I wanted detail. I mean, I could get detail, pretty good detail with water-based, but
it won't hold up when you cast it?
It can. It depends on how good your casting is, and that's the next curveball you're going to get. That's something you have to practice a few times, and it's, you know, it can be interesting. So with the casting, you got your sculpt done. You're ready to cast a mold. So you got to figure out one of two things. Is your mask going to be like a full head piece? Usually you just figure this out in the sculpting process. If it's just like a half mask, it's going to be easier to create one of those than if you do a full head. Now with a full head, you're going to have to figure out where your seams are going to be. So if you notice on this mask, you got the seam right up here, and when it fits, I mean it fits, you know, right in, pretty much like that. It's latex, so it's not going to fit perfectly anymore. But you got to figure out where your seam is going to be, and the seam can easily be marked with a Sharpie. You can draw on your clay, it's fine, it's not going to hurt it. You make that line, and you can start this process one of two ways as well. You can either lay down your armature down, even if you've sculpted the back. You can lay it down, and that's why I like this particular armature from them, is that it lays down flat and it's nice and even. You find your seam, and then you create blocks of water-based clay around it. You lay it down, and then you build walls around it, so that when you start laying down that stuff, it creates one half of your mold. The other way of doing it is to keep it upright, and this is another important part about making it a certain thickness before you even start sculpting, is you can take square stainless steel little what's the word I'm looking for? Sheet metal, that's what I'm looking for. Take little squares of sheet metal, and you basically pound them into the clay right where your seam is going to be. So, and you fan it out so that you have this metal wall around you. Then you can lay the clay on top of that. That way you don't have to lay it down either way. I had to do it that way because the way these crowns worked, if I laid it down, it would have just smashed it up like that when it was a sculpture. So I couldn't have just laid it down if I wanted to. Even if I wanted to lay it down on its base, I didn't want to compromise any of the detail there. So I did a fan of sheet metal around this, and then I laid water-based clay chunks basically all around it, about an inch thick all the way around it, and then built up a wall after that. Sometimes, depending on the site, I had a hard time with this sculpture because of the way these crown pieces are on it. It was a really difficult thing. That one's not so bad because, I mean, it's just one big bulk of a head back here. So you can see the seam comes up and around like that. And because there was more of a beveled edge here, I was able to create a wall a little better and then make that first side of the mold.
What are the undercuts? What's the max you can go on undercuts?
On undercuts?
Yeah, is there such a thing to worry about, undercuts with this?
Like
when I thermoform, you have to worry about undercuts. You can only go so far in an undercut when you're thermoforming.
Oh.
Because otherwise you can't get it off. Is there an issue of undercuts with this process?
It depends on what the sculpture is.
Okay.
Not so much of a problem with this,
Mm-hmm.
bigger problem with this because of there's less mass to hold up certain things, and if you cut it too hard or too shallow, you will end up ruining your sculpture in some way, shape, or form. This one, luckily, these came out pretty far out, so I was able to really get in with the sheet metal. But even still, I was worried about the clay kind of failing because there's too much weight on it.
Mm-hmm.
So what you do is you basically take water-based clay. You have your fanned out sheet metal. You actually can hot glue the sheet metal together, give it a little more stability, and then you pack water-based clay chunks underneath the sheet metal, and it will hold it up long enough for you to create 1/2 of your mold. When you create 1/2 of your mold, it's all cured, you can just lay it flat down and just sit on that and then work on this back half. One thing I did not do with this one, and it was just because of the unique shape of the sculpt, I didn't really need to, is you create keys. So what you do on a normal regular mask, your head here, you will have your fanned out pieces of sheet metal like so. And then you will basically just add clay blocks around. So it'll look more like that. So this is just all clay. To create keys, and they sell these separately or you can just make your own. You can do it one of two ways. You can add clay that are little round bumps so that when you create the second half, it actually has something to line up with. Otherwise, you will have a hard time putting your sides together and you won't have any sort of, your mask will look all goofy. You can add or you can scoop away the clay so that you have divots. There are some people who will take like a Sharpie end and just, dig out a little hole with that and call it good. So you'll do that first, and then you'll want to create walls off of these, and they'll be standing up so that you basically have a little bowl to work with. Once you have that down, then you can start working with the UltraCal 30. Now the UltraCal 30 needs to be mixed a certain way. And it's kind of crappy the way it works. You have to figure out how much water you need first, and then you add this to it. So get yourself like an ice cream bucket, like one of those big gallon ones, and fill it up with water, probably about halfway. Actually, you could probably do a little less than that. And then you basically just sift in your UltraCal 30, and you get it mixed up. Add water to it because then it starts reacting before all of it gets saturated with the water, and you'll end up with this inconsistent mess of stuff, and it doesn't cure the same way as if you added the UltraCal before or to the water instead of the other way around.
Interesting.
And you have to just sift it in until you get the consistency you want. The best way to start with a mold, let's say you have it laying down, you're going to want a thinner consistency because it'll pour in here, and with this kind of clay, it'll just like beat off of it. It'll just beat off of it. You eventually got to get to a point where its consistency will kind of grab onto the clay, and you just have to just brush it on, keep brushing it on until it kind of sticks to it. It's going to take it a minute before it does that. But you go through your first layer of a really thin consistency of UltraCal 30. And then you have to create another batch of UltraCal 30 that's a little thicker. And that basically just means a little less water, more UltraCal 30. And it's going to end up being closer to like nacho cheese kind of consistency. So you'll have that first layer set. And you actually want to do maybe 2 or 3 layers of that just to make sure the thinner UltraCal 30 mixture gets more of the detail. That's what that first couple layers is about.
When you were sifting it in there to get it in there to get the consistency, is that just mixing with your hand? Is that constantly mixing? You know, is it?
Sift it in, mix it up a little bit, sift it in, back and forth. It's not detrimental to your hands or anything.
Well, and it's
you're not
not
going to
like,
let it set on your hands.
right. It's not like you're sitting there stirring it constantly or something. You've got to. Okay.
So that's basically all you do with the mixture process is just by hand, and you want to put it in buckets. You're also going to want to have like a 5-gallon bucket full of just clean regular water to rinse your hands off with. You do not, under any circumstances, want to wash your hands in a sink at home, in the bathroom or whatever, a kitchen sink, because you're basically rinsing this mixture down in there, and it will solidify in your pipes if you put enough down in there. So get a 5-gallon bucket, halfway full, something you can wash your hands in, because it'll cause problems, much bigger problems than you want. So luckily I've never had that problem. But
now you said to have like different batches of that. Couldn't you just keep adding the Ultra Cal and making it thicker and thicker and just keep use that?
Well, that's the thing is when you make your first couple of really thin consistency, I mean, you're going to use all of it.
Oh, okay.
You're going to go through it all. If you have a little left over, great, but
Gotcha.
you want to use it all because of the way you mix it. You can't just add more water into it.
Correct.
So you have to basically start fresh every single time you make a new batch of stuff. But when you get to the point where you're doing the thicker nacho cheese kind of consistency, you just will layer it on, and it'll start curing as you're doing this. You might have, depending on the temperature of the water you use, the colder the water you use, the more time it gives you to actually apply the Ultra Cal 30. If you use hot water, your time might be 15 minutes to use it before it starts activating and curing. So use the coldest water you got, and that'll extend your time to 30, 40 minutes at most. But you'll, by the time you're putting on that thicker consistency, that bottom layer should already start curing a little bit and grabbing the detail out of your sculpt. And then you'll just keep applying the thicker mixture together until it kind of meets up to close to the top of your wall that you've created on your kind of your dam, if you will. And basically you just let it set once you have enough. And it's going to be kind of hard to figure out exactly how thick you need it. I mean, that's how thick I made that top layer. And there's a reason for that. When you take these two pieces apart, and this is very, very exemplary of it, little hair cracks all through in here, because when I was taking this apart, even though I had put release agent in it, it still held on to itself. And so when I was trying to pry it apart, you get all these cracks. Very rarely do you get a mold that's pulled apart that does not have cracks all through it. Little hair fine ones are fine, but when you get bigger ones, that's why some of this clay is still in here. There are bigger cracks all throughout it that I had to either just take my time with it, or I could muscle through it and break it, and then I wouldn't have anything to show you guys, basically. But you can kind of see some of the hairline cracks on the front here as well. And that is, see some of the cracks right there in the dome right here. And that's just from taking it apart. That's just going to happen. There's some bigger ones actually right here that you can see.
Do you expect molds like this to last a while, or do you expect them to do that?
Molds like this, depending on the complexity of them, this is a fairly complex one just because of the multi-layer part of it. But I would expect to get, you could probably pull 20 to 30 masks out of that before you really start having it. And the only reason that you're going to be limited to that much, if it's already got cracks and stuff, is because it is heavy to begin with. You can lift up one of these and just get an idea of what half of it feels like. It's heavy. You're probably, I mean, I had to get a bucket of Ultra Cal that was 50 pounds of just the base material. And then when it hardens, I mean, it's hefty. And that's for a mask that's too small. I got to make one bigger than that to make one that's going to fit my head. This, I had a friend help me with making this. I did most of the work, but he helped kind of guide my hand a little bit. And we actually were able to pull off that. I mean, it was a little heavier than that one, but this mask went a lot easier pulling it apart because there's nothing, no multi-layered stuff. This layer thing is very, very difficult. I didn't realize how difficult it would be. So I've learned my lesson, but I will probably end up doing it again. This one is not so bad because it's just, I mean, if you look underneath it, it's basically a whole head under there, and so it's nothing really terrible to pull apart. There's no layers I got to worry about dealing with.
Quick question on the mask. Was the mouse on the Stephensen Sculpt, or?
Yeah, these are all latex pieces, but they're glued in after the fact. Everything, these two and this were all not there. That's another way to kind of do some masks, and you want to avoid doing too many extra pieces to glue onto a mask because there's just more things to go wrong with a mask. But for this one, it was relatively smaller pieces, so yeah, I mean, it's all latex. It's obviously solid latex right up here. It does hollow out a little bit right there, but for the most part, you just make smaller sculpts, smaller molds, and you're able to make those.
So you don't make the whole, you don't build all of that and then cut it off?
There's no hair here, obviously.
No, but the face.
Oh, no. You basically create your sculpt, and these weren't on there. You basically create just a flat surface.
This right here, this was all there.
This was all here,
okay.
yes.
All right.
These, you can see the seam.
Yeah.
Those are the only parts that weren't sculpted onto the mask to begin with. So, I mean, and that's just another version of variety within the whole thing.
Your signature, sir.
So.
You're the man.
It's kind of.
So,
with using the Ultra Cal, why not use like a brush-on silicone mold with a mother mold?
The reason you will use Ultra Cal 30 is if you want a soft, pliable end product. If you want a resin piece that's rigid and hard, then you make a silicone mold. That's the way it works. If you want a soft end product, you got to use a hard mold. If you want a hard end product, use a soft mold. That's how that works. And the cool thing with silicone, and that's why I have smoothon.com there, is that's where you get silicone material. At least that's where I like to get it from. Silicone is cool because nothing sticks to silicone but silicone. It's easier to use as an end product because it just pops right out of your molds and everything like that. The only thing with silicone is that there's a much more involved process in creating a mold because silicone comes in two different products that you have to mix, and they have to react, and then you have to pour it to create your mold. And there's two ways to do silicone. You can do it by weight or by volume, and that means you have to have a scale handy that will measure in grams. So you have to measure your trying to think of what they call it. You got your reaction material and then your base product. So you have to mix those.
Your catalyst.
Your catalyst. That's what. Yeah, your catalyst and your base. And so you have to mix the catalyst into the base, not the other way around. Kind of like when you mix the Ultra Cal 30. And there's a whole bunch of different kinds of silicone products out there. Some silicones are going to be translucent, some not. Some are going to be used more for wearability and some not. There's a lot more to silicone that I'm not too knowledgeable with because I haven't really used silicone outside of making molds with. I only made that and this. And this is just all resin as well. And to make this, I had made this mask, and I basically did a cardboard base over it so that I could at least, so I mean it just fits on just like that. There's magnets that hold it on, but Not too difficult to make that. I don't really think there's any other costumes I can think of that have a mask and then a mask on top of it. So,
And to make that one, do you do the same process as with that?
yeah, exactly. And this is a perfect example of just a half mask. When you're doing just a half mask, you're basically just going to end up with half of that.
Correct.
Even though it's resin, you basically can just brush it on and then let it set and then pull it out of the silicone mold.
Did you use the fiberglass you put into, or just the resin?
Just the resin. Just the resin. And there's actually a little.
But you do have to. I meant, do you have to sculpt that as well?
Yes.
And
yes,
then so you go through the same process.
This
as
was
everything
sculpted.
else.
Yes.
Gotcha.
There is a step I forgot in the mold making process. If you notice on these, you have this fibrous stuff. That's just burlap.
Oh, burlap.
It's burlap. What you do is you will lay down that thinner layers. You get your thinner layers down first. When you start mixing up the thicker stuff, you will basically dip burlap in it, get it nice and worked in there, and you will just layer it. You'll probably put down 2 or 3 layers of Ultra Cal drenched in, or burlap drenched in Ultra Cal, and then that'll create a stronger underbase for you. Because if it was just the straight Ultra Cal, pulling it apart, it would break every time. The burlap holds it together much better. It just gives you that much more security. It gives you like a netting underneath it. It's kind of like putting rebar down when you lay down concrete. It's basically the same concept. Process is pretty much the same with the feet and the hands. There's a seam that you can see here.
Oh, now that you mentioned hands, so how would you go about doing that? Do you sculpt the hand and then make a negative and then put your hand and then pour it?
No. Hands are actually pretty easy outside of getting into the finer areas here. Yeah. You basically do your sculpt. The
hand that you want, the end product.
Yeah, you do you sculpt a hand. Make sure you got a good armature so it can actually hold up to this. And because hands aren't too terribly difficult as far as
you sculpt
detail.
Your hand or a hand.
No, you have an armature.
Yeah.
An armature is going to be just a wire frame.
Sure. So
that's all you're going to have, but make sure it's close to the size of your hand.
Got it.
I can't stress that enough. I feel stupid when I look at these gloves. But with doing a hand, all you do is you just kind of lay down kind of a bed of water-based clay and maybe put a little layer of cellophane or something and just lay it down on top of that, and then you just build your dam around it so that you can do 1/2, and then once that cures, you just flip it over and you still have your exposed clay on this side. Basically do the same thing. You create a little wall around it and then apply your Ultra Cal, and then you'll have 2 halves that are like that. And then you just fill it. When you get to the actual phase where you have a mold and before you actually pull it all apart, that's what all these tools are for. Get yourself a rubber mallet and some pry bars, essentially. And these all came in like a little pack. Can't remember where I got them. I think I just Home Depot or whatever. But get yourself a rubber mallet. Do not use a steel hammer under any circumstances when you're pulling these apart, because the steel hammer will basically just have so much force it'll go right through your cement mold, and you will end up with no mold. You basically got to find your seams and right in here. And you just take your hammer and a chisel of varying size. You got to get in there, and you basically just got to slowly chisel away, chisel, until you get a little give. And then you slowly, it took me probably an hour to pull that apart. Wow.
So these shows just,
oh,
they've been edited too.
Oh, yes. I mean, if you watch the Face Off,
Yeah,
you'll
those
see
are
that they've got 10 hours in a day. Yeah, they're spending that entire 10 hours screwing with stuff. It's not just, oh, I'm just going to make this, and oop, we're doing this, and then, no, it is, and if you've never done it before, it'll take you 3 to 4 times as long just to get the
feel for it.
The feel for it and everything else. It is.
Occasionally show them struggling with
Yeah,
it.
yeah. And there's some that
And they
where they're
break.
like, they break,
Yeah.
and you're like, I mean, I see that.
That's why I see you like reusing it. I'm like, how do you do it? Because these guys just, they break it. Well, they know they're not going to
There's
use
some,
it.
yeah, there's some that will break it, and you can use a little bit of UltraCal to kind of create a Band-Aid. Luckily, for their purposes, they're using foam latex, not slip latex. Slip latex is your liquid latex. I didn't bring any in because.
Okay, so this is what latex? Just
liquid latex.
this one's liquid,
Liquid latex.
and then you have.
And then you have foam latex.
Okay.
Foam latex creates like your prosthetics that you actually glue onto your skin. It's kind of a foamy material.
Gotcha. All right.
This
This
is,
is the foam latex.
all of this is just slip latex. It's just regular latex. Now, one of the most important things I ever found is this top email or website, FX Supply. This is a local supplier for materials of this sort of stuff and for makeups and all that sort of stuff. They are a local special effects supply company. It's a little hole-in-the-wall store, but they have a fairly decent website. You go there, that's where I get my latex now. It's where I get my UltraCal 30 because if you buy it online from Monster Makers or somewhere else, you will have to pay for shipping. The bad part about that is latex is not light, neither is UltraCal 30 in the amounts that you're going to need. For making a full mask, you're going to want to buy 50 pounds of UltraCal 30, and you're going to go through 95% of it. And you're probably looking at about $40 just for the UltraCal 30, not including shipping.
Wow.
For 50 pounds of it.
Speaking of shipping, do you actually use smoothon.com when you do your orders for silicone, or do you?
But for silicone, I will.
You're going to want to use Reynolds Advanced.
Reynolds?
Yeah, they're actually a smoothon distributor, and they're out of Denver.
Oh, are
so
they?
they'll
Okay.
give us on shipping.
Oh, okay.
So I'll give you that.
Yeah. It's been a while since I've had to use silicone for any reason, but
Yeah, I made the mistake of ordering my first few things of silicone from Smooth-On, but I found out from a friend that Reynolds Advanced actually ships it out from Denver. So
yeah, that is actually very helpful. But yeah, the FX Supply place is they're in right on the border of North Salt Lake and southern end of Bountiful. I mean, they're like right on that border. Like I said, it's a little hole-in-the-wall place. They do have instructions on how to get to them on their site and everything. If you intend on going through all this stuff and you want to buy latex, and you want to buy the UltraCal 30, you're going to want to call them or email them beforehand because they don't always have this, you know, massive amount on hand. And so the more you prepare yourself and call ahead of time, make sure they have everything you need, the better off. A gallon of latex is going to run you about $40 as well. To make one of these masks, I probably went through, just for this mask, you're going to have to buy 2 gallons of latex. Because the way it works is when you get to the point where you're ready to pour, you get your strap on here, and you make sure it's whatever. You make sure that band's on there good. So you got your opening. You're basically going to fill this up and then dump it back out. And then fill it back up and then dump it back out. You're going to do that. You're going to do the first layer. It's actually pretty good to take just a cheapo, painter's brush
$1.
and paint the inside of it a little bit with latex to kind of grab the detail of the mold itself. And then kind of let it dry. Don't let it dry completely, but dry enough to where it'll hold. And then you fill it up, dump it out, wait 10 minutes, fill it up, dump it out.
Oh my gosh, they leave a lot out.
Yes. And this is slip latex. Foam latex, they dump it in once, call it good, because it'll just, it'll foam up. That's why it's called that.
Around the hour.
Okay. So that's basically the difference is this needs time to just set up and cure, and you're going to need layers of it.
Okay.
The more layers you have of it.
How long have you been doing this?
5 years for this stuff. I've been costuming for about 15. But
What do you mean customers?
what I used to do back in the day was before Halloween shops were producing mass amounts of garbage, they actually had some measure of qualities to some of the items they had.
Yeah.
And so I would just take some of their costumes, and even though they weren't as good as I wanted them to be, I would take costumes and just modify them. And then I realized I should just start making my own costumes. And that's how I got more into this more involved, insanely expensive end of things.
Wow. What is the work time on latex once you've mixed up the latex?
It depends on how thick you've made it. It depends. Like this particular mask, because of these recessed parts of the mold, I let this set for a week before I pulled those apart because I didn't want to screw with it not being set and pulling it apart and not having a mask because some parts of it were still wet. Because it takes a while to cure, even if it's warm. The colder it is, the more time it takes to cure. But yeah, you don't want to make it too thick. You don't want to dump it, fill it and dump it too many times and create this really thick layer where it'll take 2 weeks to cure. You want something that's a little more thin. This is a pretty good, representation of what you want. It's like 1/8 of an inch thick or so, at least on that edge. Further up, it's going to be much more dense, but not too much. You still can move it. This one, you can tell where it's thicker, and these knobby parts, you can tell because it's discolored, and that just means it's thicker. So that's kind of when you can figure out exactly what you need. If you do 3 fills and dumps, that should be good enough to give you a mask that's decent enough to wear. But you want to make sure that you at least give a good coating initially to grab any detail. After that, you just let it set, and then it pulls apart pretty easily once you have your 2 halves. And just be a little careful because latex does tear. The good thing about that, though, and this is a perfect example here, I got a little tear on that. All I have to do is just lay some latex down in there. It basically fixes itself. It's like its own Band-Aid. It's kind of really cool. It's not going to be as sturdy and strong, but that is the best you're going to do, because if you completely tear it, you basically got to remake the whole thing. There's no way to really
Patch it.
You can't graft it or anything, you know what I mean? You can try, and you might get something to hold, but it's not going to last nearly as long as if it was one whole cohesive piece. So that's kind of the deal with it all.
So nothing sticks to it like Velcro, so you can probably get in there easier, cut it with Velcro. None of that?
It's hard to glue anything to latex. I actually have magnets all in here, and it took a combination of super glue, hot glue, tape.
Oh,
I mean, they're not coming out of there now.
yeah.
Super glue doesn't do too bad, but you got to get good quality super glue. So that's basically, but most of the time, no, you're not going to be able to glue straps in or something really.
Would you have put those magnets in when you're pouring it?
You can do that. You can. It's a little unpredictable on how those are going to set in there, though. It is possible, though, to basically embed magnets or
something.
Really, magnets are like you're going to embed in anything. But they work magnificently if you can. So, and you can do it with foam latex as well. Just put in. I actually have a mask that I bought online where there's a front face that peels off, like a clown mask, and underneath is a skull when you pull it off, and it just has little magnets all around it, and it's just foam latex. So it does work. You just got to be good at it. So usually that involves letting it set up almost completely, just enough so you can set the magnets in there, and then let it set up even more so they don't move and don't pour in. So, yeah, that's the basics of it. I will be doing another class at 4, and I'll probably do this even more in depth, but that's the basics of it all.
Awesome.
So.
Great.
And lunch is now ready downstairs, so